Я ухожу.
И в сортире их замочим, в конце концов.
Свобода лучше, чем не свобода.
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
Welcome to InfoCom. In a new episode of Focus on Russia, our guest is Dr. Vicken Cheteryan, who is a lecturer of international relations at University of Geneva. Vicken, welcome back to our studio.
Thank you for the invitation.
Today I would like to discuss, of course, the situation around the Lachin corridor, as well as Russia's role in the blockade, and some other issues related to the regional developments. So in one of your recent pieces, you wrote about the 1992 blockade of Nagorno Karabakh, when Artsakh didn't have any kind of corridors or roads connecting it to the outside world. You traveled to Nagorno Karabakh back then when it was under a total blockade, and it was not just under a total blockade, but it was also shelled by Azerbaijan from Shushi and other settlements. So could you compare the two situations? Are there any similarities? What are the differences? What was the reaction of the international community back then?
Yes, indeed, there are many similarities as well as differences. We find that after 30 years of conflict, after the first war and after the second war of 2020, Karabakh today is in a very dire situation. It is encircled by Azerbaijani forces, and since December 12, Azerbaijan, under the pretext of so-called eco-activists, has imposed an effective blockade on the entire population of Nagorno Karabakh. Now, there are also differences. Back in 1992, when I went there, we had flights with small airplanes as well as helicopters that made the bridge between Armenia and Karabakh. At the time, we had witnessed just early in 1992, the evacuation of the Soviet troops that were stationed there until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, we have the opposite phenomena. We have Russian peacekeeping troops stationed in Karabakh. But at the same time, we see that both the Soviet troops back then and the Russian troops today are not efficient in bringing stability and security to the population, ethnic Armenian population of mountainous Karabakh. The third difference is that back then the international situation was very different, in the sense that in 1992 we had democratic forces symbolized by Boris Yeltsin. In the early years, Yeltsin was representing democratic forces in Russia. All his collaborators thought about themselves and their project as liberal Democrats. And there was a kind of collaboration between Russia and the West. By the West, I mean European states and the USA. Today, on that field, we have a total confrontation. There's a war taking place, directly even, by Western arms being delivered to Ukraine to fight the Russian invasion there. On the other hand, there's also a similarity. Today, the issue of the blockade and the situation of Karabakh is overwhelmed by the events in Ukraine. Back in the early 1990s, it was similar. The story of conflicts in the Caucasus, not only Karabakh, in 1992 we had a series of conflicts, were very secondary in international news reporting, because the major event back then was the wars in the Balkans, the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. And one of the other points you always make, that there is this assumption in the international expert circles, people who work on the Caucasus, who focus on the South Caucasus, and when they cover the Nagorno-Karabakh war, they oftentimes present a picture like if the conflict started in 1993, when the Armenian forces started, taking control of territories outside the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. And this situation, I think, reminds a lot of people that the conflict started like this, that people of Nagorno Karabakh were under a suppressive regime, and that's how the conflict started. And I think this situation, of course, it's a very dire situation, it's a very difficult situation, but could be a reminder what were the sources of this conflict, what was the starting point of this conflict. You talked about the role of the Russian peacekeeping forces. I would like to ask a question about that. That's one of the most frequent questions now, frequent issues that are being discussed in Armenia in the last 2 months. What are the reasons behind Russia's inaction in this situation? Is Russia incapable of solving the situation, or is Russia unwilling to take more active steps and to resolve the Lachin corridor crisis?
It is a very serious and very complex question. It is evident that today Russia is weaker than before February 2020, when Russia invaded Ukraine. That's very, very evident, right? Russian resources have diminished. Yet, I would argue that Russia still has resources to solve the problem if it wills to do so. But it costs Russia a lot, because Russia is very much consumed in this enormous war that is taking place in Ukraine. But to be able to give a complete answer to your question, we have to go back to the events of 2020, the Second Karabakh War. And there too, we see that Russia did not necessarily take a pro-Armenian position, in spite of the fact that Russian-Armenian relations are closer. Russia and Armenia have strategic and military agreements of collaborating. And on top of this, Turkey intervened in favor of Azerbaijan. So there were a number of factors that would have made someone think that Russia should have been more active. Eventually, Russia did take action. On the 44th day, Russia decided to intervene. But until then, Russia was very passive. Russia could have intervened militarily before that. So we should understand why the Russian leadership tolerated such a war, where Armenia was left alone against a larger alliance. And also why Russia was very passive against Azerbaijani military attacks against Armenia itself, as well as against Karabakh. Last year, we had two major events when Azerbaijani military attacked Karabakh itself. So there's a passivity from the side of the Russian leadership, which dates before the war in Ukraine. I will not pretend that I know why this is taking place, but for Armenian analysts and Armenian decision makers, this should be understood before articulating any political position to answer to the question, if Russia is not willing or able to help us in this period, what are the solutions Armenia should seek in return?
Yeah, I mean, this question has been discussed a lot in Armenia, and this question has been directed to the Russian side on the expert level or even on the official level. Well, the official explanation is that, back in 2020, Russia didn't have any kind of obligations towards Nagorno Karabakh. Armenia was the zone of its responsibility. But as you rightly mentioned, after the war, there were several instances of attacks against Armenian sovereign territory, and Moscow didn't act and hasn't been acting. And that's one of the reasons behind the ongoing crisis in the relations between Yerevan and Moscow. But in this situation, Russia has obligations which are clearly stipulated in the November 9 agreement. And it is really interesting that Russia, for Russia at this point, relations with Azerbaijan and Turkey are probably more important than even the international image of its peacekeeping force that has been humiliated in the last 2 months. Another question that Russia, or another issue that Russia has objections about, is the deployment of the EU monitoring mission to the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. Interestingly enough, Baku also objects to this mission. There have been already several statements coming from Moscow and Baku saying that this won't create an atmosphere of stability. President Aliyev actually says that the European Union hasn't been true to its word when they agreed in Prague to deploy a short-term mission. for 2 months, and then Armenia and the EU used this agreement to actually prolong or create or establish a new mission. For the Russians, of course, the actual presence of European even monitors, unarmed monitors, is a challenge. Foreign Minister Lavrov even said that this won't contribute to the stability and could have actually the opposite effect. So there are these statements coming from Moscow and Baku. Baku is also saying, that this won't provide stability. Do you think there is a possibility that Russia and Azerbaijan will try to destabilize the situation after the deployment to show that all these efforts by the European Union and by the Armenian authorities to bring stability to the region by deploying this mission are useless and won't have anything? Is there a chance that this deployment of this mission could actually trigger a new escalation?
I think not. I think we should separate Azerbaijani perspective from the Russian perspective. I think mixing them is not useful, and it is done very often in debates in Armenia. I don't think that the Russian leadership and the Azerbaijani leadership sat down and said, how shall we punish Armenia? And then they thought about these events in Lachin. It doesn't work like that. Now, the European mission is very clear. It's a message to Azerbaijan saying that we don't want events like September 22 attack against Armenia. The message of this mission is that. I understand very well that Azerbaijan is not happy because it will restrict its possibilities of putting massive pressure on Armenia and the Armenian political leadership. So that's one thing. Now, coming to Russia, I think the Russians should face the responsibility that if they are unable to give their nominal ally the protection Armenia needs at this stage, at least to tolerate that Armenia looks for other solutions to secure its existential security against Azerbaijani threats. Now that Lavrov is dissatisfied, I understand, but I do not expect that from the Russian side there will be any kind of manipulations and escalation against Armenia because of the EU presence here. And what matters is that Armenian diplomacy should be able to integrate this European mission within its other resources, including the Russian military presence in Armenia, and especially the Russian military presence in Karabakh. I mean, without the Russian military presence in Karabakh, ethnic Armenians in mountainous Karabakh will not stay there. So Russian presence there is essential for the Armenian side. And it is the task of the Armenian political leadership, and especially Armenian diplomacy, to be able to create harmony between these two presences. Otherwise, the price Armenia, and especially Karabakh Armenians, will pay is very high.
Yeah, I think these are very important points, and lots of people in the West understand, people who are engaged in our region understand that you cannot use the same logic in the relationship with Russia as it exists in Ukraine or in other parts of the world. Lots of people understand that Russia is an important stakeholder and actor in our region, and even on the level of public statements, they are ready to cooperate. We remember that U.S. diplomats have announced on a number of occasions that they are ready to cooperate with Russia in the Armenian-Azerbaijani context and so on. But unfortunately, there is also the opposite trend when the logic of confrontation is being brought to the region by both sides. There is that trend, and the Armenian government, I agree, that should oppose these attempts. And my last question will be about Armenia-Russia relations. You touched upon the topic a bit in your previous reply, but there is a tendency in Armenia to look at the Armenia-Russia relations through white and black lenses. You know, there is this assumption that if Russia does something which doesn't correspond to the Armenian interest in one issue, it means that there is no need to talk, to cooperate. Russia is being presented as an enemy state. Of course, there are Russian actions that are, that are not laudable, that are negative in a number of issues. But we know that this government, for example, is promoting the idea that you should be able to talk even to enemies. All these talks about peace, the era of peace and negotiations with Turkey and Azerbaijan. And I agree with them. I mean, without conversations and negotiations, you won't be able to even minimize the existing risk. But on the other hand, there is this reluctance to actually try to understand what the Russians want, try to cooperate on different levels, and not just on the top level, but on different levels of decision making. So what is your take on that? What should the Armenian government do to stabilize its relations with Russia? Because the developments in the last several months are not, promoting the peace in the region. There have been statements coming from Armenian officials that were irritating the Russian leadership. All these talks about the link between the Lachin corridor blockade and the Zangezur corridor agenda, statements coming from very top level. What's your take on that?
I think the problem with Armenia-Russia relations is very old, and it is structural. Armenia for years and probably decades has been receiving resources from Russia, and in return has not much to give. So when Russia has problems, Armenia has not much to offer. And this is a problem, and this should be corrected. Even if you have on paper alliance treaty, when there are periods when the whole international relations is based on services, I give you this, you give me that, and if Armenia has nothing much to give to Russia, Russia will ignore Armenia. So that's one point. And exactly, Armenia could have become one of the few platforms where Russian officials, politicians, diplomats, security people talk to their Western counterparts. And Armenia should have played more active role in this. Not just by formally bringing together people from different places, but using the problems of Armenia, where Russian, European, and American decision makers come together and create a space for collaboration. By doing that, Armenia would become relevant, which is not the case today. Second point, when we open the map of Armenia and we enlarge it a bit, we see that Armenia is part of a two-tier system. There's the three South Caucasus republics encircled by three medium powers. Russia is the most important, then Turkey, then Iran. Within these three powers, the one which has given and which can give the most resources to Armenia is Russia. And to think that Armenia can have the luxury to alienate Russia is simply irresponsible. Now I understand that there are problems between Yerevan and Moscow, that Armenia has expectations from Russia which were not fulfilled. But Armenia should do everything to understand what Russia is ready to give to Armenia at this very difficult period and to take the maximum possible. And it is up to Armenia to understand that it cannot ask from Russia more than Russia can give. Because if you do that, then you will be disappointed, frustrated, and then lead a very wrong policy.
Well, yeah, you are describing a situation when foreign policy is conducted not based on emotions, but on, rational calculations. Unfortunately, we don't have that situation in Armenia yet. And it's not the case only in the relations with Russia, but all the other, international actors. But hopefully we will come at this point sometime in the future. So Vicken, thank you a lot for a very interesting conversation. We're always glad to have you in our studio.
Thank you, Tigran.